I can summarise my findings of the response as too little, too late. All four governments failed to appreciate the scale of the threat or the urgency of response it demanded in the early part of 2020.
The chair of the COVID inquiry wraps up the latest stage with these damning findings. We'll discuss what else Baroness Hallett said and what it means for politics and how the country handles crises in the future on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and because we're going to be talking about the latest stage of the COVID inquiry, we reunited the duo who have taken us through the previous stages. Here's our health reporter, Jim Reid. Hello, Jim.
Hi, Adam.
And Catherine Haddon from the Institute for Government Think Tank. Hello.
Hello, Adam.
And Jim, you've just come straight from the inquiry and you've brought us the paper copy of this phase. So it's two quite thick documents, and this is phase 2, which, to give it its technical name, was about
the big political decisions that are being taken in COVID. 800 pages, Adam, of that. 800 pages of just this report. And that is just one of 10 sections of this inquiry. So it gives you an idea about how detailed it is. And I should say this, because the way that they ran this bit of the inquiry, they do one big chunk that was just in London, Westminster politicians, that kind of thing. And then they took it on tour and they went to Belfast, they went to Cardiff, they went to Edinburgh. So that includes the conclusions from all four of those bits.
And Kath, as a scrutineer of governments all over the UK, actually there's as much in there about Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast as there is London.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really interesting from that point of view and have quite a long shelf life just on looking at that interrelationship, because honestly, on parts of government, there's lots of people have looked at different parts of how cabinet government decision making happens, the role of the Prime Minister and stuff. But that relationship between the four governments isn't usually looked at. And this was such an acute period to look at it. So It's really fascinating.
And I hadn't realised just how chaotic things had been in Northern Ireland, because politics really infected, if you pardon the pun, every decision, and it got really, really bad at some points. Jim, just in terms of how this has been delivered by Baroness Hallett, the chair, I mean, how did it work today?
So it's that kind of weird journalistic thing where, well, actually, it wasn't just the journalists. It was all what are called the parties that were involved in this. So they all got to see the report from 8:30 this morning, and then we all got to talk to it. And there's this bizarre thing where it's incredibly strict security. So you have to put your mobile phones in a plastic bag. They take them away. But they do leave you your laptop computer and give you a Wi-Fi password. So you're like, well, if you want to get the information out, you could do. And then you get kind of 5 or 6 hours to read this report. And then at the end of it all, at about 3:45, the whole thing is what's called embargo till 4 o'clock, where you get to leave at 3:45 and go and stand in the freezing cold, as you see on TV, next to presenters and that kind of thing. And then we're allowed to deliver the conclusions at that point. But I think the idea there is they don't want, a kind of rush to judgment too much. They want at least people to be able to digest it a bit.
Reading it,
but I mean, saying that, you can't read 800 pages in 4 hours, but nevertheless, you can give it a try, I suppose.
And also that's why we have Control F. So you
Indeed.
can search for it. And also Baroness Hallett, she did a sort of pre-recorded speech that was played out at 4 o'clock with her sort of summarising her conclusions.
She did, and she took. It was quite interesting. It was long. It was 25 minutes long, but she took the whole audience through the pandemic really in a chronological order, starting at the beginning and going through to the end. And in a way, that's the way that the report is laid out as well, to take the viewer through it in that way.
Yeah, because you can read the summary at the start, which is still quite detailed, and that gives you a real good gist of what's in it. And then there's all these different chapters about different things like structures in government, the timing of the decisions, the relationships between the different devolved governments, how the messaging landed with the public. Kath, the big thing is, from Baroness Hallett, too little, too late.
Yep.
What are the things that were too little, and why was the timing so off?
Yeah, to take them sort of chronologically, obviously the first bit was looking at that very early 2020 decision making, and at that time, we all have to cast our minds back, the Department for Health and Social Care were leading very much the sort of effort. Obviously, there were criticisms. She's got criticisms of COBRA meetings not being chaired by the Prime Minister early enough, which is implying he wasn't gripping it early enough. So criticisms of Boris Johnson there, but also a lot of criticisms of the Department of Health, but also its leadership, Matt Hancock, and also its then permanent secretary, Sir Chris Wormold, about whether they were presenting a too rosy a picture of how well they were gripping it and not really showing that actually this is going to be worse. So by the time you get to late February, we obviously remember, what was happening in Italy as well. By the time then into March, we actually locked down. She says, look, if you had locked down just a week earlier, she gave figures of 23,000 fewer deaths that she thinks you could have saved if you locked down a week earlier. But it's a really difficult counterfactual when you think about the decision making that they were making. But she's pointing to where they did have evidence. So she's trying to say it was reasonable for them to have had the evidence to realise that they needed to take action sooner. And I think that's the basis on which she's making that statement.
And Jim, one of the other counterfactuals is this idea that if the initial set of restrictions, like working from home, staying home if you were ill, isolating if a family member was ill as well, which had been put into place on the 16th of March, if those kind of pre-lockdown measures had been put in place earlier, Baroness Hallett is arguing you maybe wouldn't have had to have the full lockdown at all. Is that what she says?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a danger that people see that headline too little too late and think that what she was calling for was tougher restrictions all the way through and longer lockdowns. That's actually not at all what she's saying. And it comes up again, I think, in the autumn as well. She's basically saying if you took faster decisions, you could get out of lockdown even earlier. Because you're starting from a much lower base of infection. So that, that would have reduced all those harms that we've talked about so much, the impacts on education, the societal impacts. So it's not a matter of longer, harder lockdowns that she was calling for. And she makes that point in the autumn in particular. I think she says it's inexcusable that the lessons that should have been learnt in the first wave, and then there is slightly more of a kind of reasoning or an excuse. Because you sort of think, well, this was new to everyone. And, everyone was kind of panicking and rushing around and leaders didn't know what they were doing. But by the time you get to kind of September, October, the lessons should have been learned, yet we fell into the same mistakes again.
Yeah. And I mean, if you remember back, she also points to the fact that in the sort of February, March period, we didn't have the scientific information, but by September we did. And I mean, the reality is for those of us who were in and around this, talking about it at the time, I remember doing stuff in, summer of 2020, we were like, you need to do a lessons learned immediately, urgently about what's just happened to prepare in case this comes back. And so there were people already saying it. So I think it's much harder then to sort of say it was a really hard choice and it's hard to do the counterfactuals because people were saying it at the time.
And also inexcusable is quite a sort of polite word, but in this context, to be used by a judge in a statutory inquiry, it's quite damning, isn't it? Even though it sounds like quite a polite word. And she also says it sort of happened again later on in 2021, once most people, and certainly all the vulnerable people, were vaccinated. They hadn't worked out what to do if there was a variant that like kind of leapfrogged the vaccine. And there were plenty of variants around. So she said that's another example where the lessons of the immediate past hadn't been learnt. Jim, talk to me about why these decisions, she says, were made too late. Was it just that we didn't have the science about how the vaccine was transmitted and things like the number of people who were asymptomatic but still carrying the virus?
I think in that first part of the pandemic, there was two things going on. One, and Catherine's talked about this, is the politicians were getting a lot of reassurance from the Department of Health. They're like, we are the best prepared country in the world. Don't worry too much about it. And they say that that was basically rubbish and completely wrong. And also they say that the surveillance systems in the UK were just not up to scratch. So essentially COVID was spreading in the UK in that kind of January, February, early March period much faster than the authorities realised. So we were sitting here and there was, we heard this in the inquiry, there was a slight British exceptionalism thing going on where we were looking at what was going on in Italy and officials were thinking, look at those continentals, look at the Italians and they're having to do their lockdown, and not realising that actually this was happening in our country at that moment. And then as you move into the autumn, again, that changes somewhat. And I think there's more of a criticism there that Boris Johnson wasn't listening to the science in the way that maybe he could have done. And he had these people on stage and Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance in September saying you need to be doing a circuit breaker lockdown.
That 2-week one.
That 2-week one. And that got ignored. And she says in the report, if they'd done that circuit breaker lockdown again, they might not have had to do the more draconian measures in November and again potentially in January that they end up having to do.
But Kath, I remember when Boris Johnson was giving his evidence in person, and he said, look, the scientists weren't telling me that lockdowns were even an option or something I should be considering. So you can't blame me, Boris Johnson, for not sort of sticking my finger in there and just going, oh, let's do a lockdown.
Yeah,
What's
so
your take on that?
This is, I think, the point at which you have to start thinking about what were the civil servants doing at this time, especially those senior ones, because the whole phrase, and again, she's critical of this, the following the science thing. It is not generally the scientist's job to then decide what the policy should be. Yes, especially with the range of scientists that you've got looking at different aspects of, if you did this kind of epidemiological intervention, what would happen? But that's kind of running scenarios. It's not necessarily coming to a judgment of advice to ministers of what you should do. And then obviously there is also the ministers themselves, that it is for them to make those bold decisions and to figure out what you should do. And that's when, we saw it in the March lockdown, that just a small number of people, including Dominic Cummings, actually telling Boris Johnson, no, you've got to, we are, the F word, if you don't do this kind of thing. And a larger number of people who were still very hesitant. And that's the thing. It kind of shows up. You really need that kind of imagination of what can you do differently when something so out of your experience in policymaking terms. You've got to start to think like completely outside the box. And that's where you really need good skill set of policy making and judgment.
And also, Jim, it's a lesson in how the way things are set up can have huge impacts. For example, SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, I had to remember what it stood for there, even though it used to be like a word we'd use in every sentence. Their job wasn't to kind of invent new things to present to the government. They were there to just look at the science and do the tasks that they were given by ministers. They weren't meant to dream up previously unforeseen lockdown scenarios.
No, and one of the things that's in the report is one of the recommendations is that should this happen again, what you need is the government to set proper, almost like targets for SAGE. So if you went to this group of advisors, these scientists, and said, okay, my objective here is to keep infections at this level and not to go into lockdown. How do I do it? Then you might get better advice than, just tell us what the situation is then, please, which is essentially what happened in the pandemic, I think.
Yeah. And I think it also goes to you really got to understand like how Whitehall works. It isn't all structures and so forth. And this is where there might be some pushback on some of the recommendations, that as if structures just solve this thing.
But more meetings.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, definitely more cabinet meetings is not going to get you through this stuff. But where you see the slightly more successful things, so, the furlough scheme, some of the shielding policy, it's often where you've got a group of, civil servants driven by a minister or whatever, who are focused on one particular thing. Where government, Whitehall, all of the governments really struggled is when it's like looking across loads of different policy, it's all interconnected and different departments all needing to speak to each other and all of that. That is the stuff that it's always really difficult, and they fell down on it.
Not helped by the fact there was what the inquiry describes as a toxic culture in Downing Street around the Prime Minister and his advisors. Toxic, for example, because women were shouted down in meetings, and we already saw the WhatsApps of various people that were quite derogatory towards senior women in Whitehall. Jim, tell us a bit more about what it says about Boris Johnson and his crew, if you like.
This is the bit I think when you look at it that may well end up in the newspaper headlines tomorrow morning. I mean, they talk about this toxic and chaotic culture, but then they do name names. And in particular, Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's former chief advisor, comes up again and again in this. And we remember reporting on the time about some of the WhatsApps that were being exchanged. He makes these comments about Helen McNamara, who's the most senior female civil servant in Whitehall. I can't use the language on Newscast, but dodging stilettos from that, and then a really serious swear word. It's interesting because they say Hallett says in the report today that Cummings had an undoubted ability, many useful qualities, also gets heavily criticised, destabling influence. And this quote, his behaviour contributed to a culture of fear, mutual suspicion and distrust that poisoned the atmosphere in 10 Downing Street and undermined the Prime Minister. I mean, that is serious stuff. And then they go on to essentially criticise Johnson for not cracking down on this enough.
And Dominic Cummings has posted quite a big post on social media on X saying the inquiry's been a mix of Inspector Clouseau, cover-ups and rewriting history. The lawyers have paid themselves millions and made understanding of what happened even worse. He added, if you want to understand what happened on COVID, buy the box set of Yes Minister. It's all there. And Kath, there's also quite a lot of ammo for Boris Johnson's critics, isn't there? For example, and you sort of alluded to this, a meeting of the government's Cobra committee in the spring that he didn't go to. That was a kind of recurring theme in kind of critical newspapers at the time and on social media. And Baroness Hallett says, yeah, he should have been there.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Look, there is an argument that you need a well-functioning Cobra and you need it to have the right people in the room, getting the right information in. Cobra can be both an area where you're checking that everyone's got all the right information, can also be a decision-making forum. As long as the right people are there and doing it, yes, you can argue that somebody else can chair it. And sometimes that's the right thing. But there's two reasons. One is obviously the signals it sends to the nation. You know, he's actually in charge. He really cares about this. He realised that too late. But the other is what we know now, that the people that were in charge of it weren't gripping it in the right way. And it's not that it's Boris Johnson needed to be there, but the Prime Minister needed to be there because somebody needed to grip it. And the only structure to do that and to bring together that cross-departmental working is number 10. And that's where you need a well-functioning number 10 led by somebody who understands the leadership role that a Prime Minister plays in that kind of scenario.
And Jim, people with authority, whether it was politicians or advisors, not sticking to the COVID rules they had come up with, Baroness Hallett is very scathing about them too. And of course, that's not just Dominic Cummings going to Barnard Castle.
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole list. I mean, breaking rules by ministers caused huge distress and, importantly, I think, undermined confidence. That's the thing. And they talk in particular about the Barnard Castle thing and how that trip increase the risk of people then deciding not to follow the rules, which sounds obvious, but I guess having a judge say that in an inquiry is the important thing here, because this is almost, to a certain extent, like the verdict on that behaviour.
Not that we're talking about a criminal process here at all. This is a statutory inquiry into what went wrong and what went right. Also, just in terms of the public health messaging, so stay at home, which has gone down in history as one of the best kind of pieces of political communication ever, also had a terrible consequence, which is that, well, people stayed at home too much when it came to their own health.
Yeah, and more than the government thought that they would do. And that's, you know, another thing that comes out of it, and also comes out of the sort of rule breaking, is that it's almost like the government didn't understand that we were all doing what we were told to do by the government. And you know, that's one of the things that supposedly drove the sort of eat out to help out kind of, how do we now reverse course on this? How do we open it up? We still need the economy to come back and so forth. So, yeah, it was that thinking through the consequences.
Well, and the consequence of stay at home was that people didn't go to hospital or to see their doctor when they had another medical problem, which contributed to ill health. And Jim, I mean, we've talked about closing schools quite recently because that's one of the other modules of the inquiry, and there was some evidence from people that we were all watching a few weeks ago. But Baroness Hallett today says that just not enough thought was given to the social consequences of lots of these decisions.
Yeah, that's one of the key recommendations, that when you make these massive decisions like closing down the country, you make them thinking about the most vulnerable groups and certain groups in society. Someone described it to me as though this is a bunch of people thinking that lockdown basically meant this is people staying at home in their big detached houses and going out into their garden now and again, and not thinking about the people that lived on the 17th floor of a tower block in the centre of Birmingham with 3 kids. And I think that is fundamentally the problem that went on here. And there needed to be a wider thinking about some of these issues before these huge decisions were made.
Quite bad reviews for Wales. Well, the government of Wales, not Wales the country. For example, really umming and ahhing about a circuit breaker lockdown. I mean, they went ahead with it in the autumn of 2020, but after a lot of shilly-shallying.
Yeah, I mean, none of the devolved governments gets, you know, let off. At one point, I think she does say Scotland did marginally better on, you know, on some of the...
Although Nicola Sturgeon was DMing health experts on Twitter.
Yeah.
Which seems like a slightly unorthodox way for a head of
and she's
government to
also
operate.
really critical of that intergovernmental kind of decision making and makes recommendations there. And like, you know, we started with that. I think I think that is really interesting because we do need better intergovernmental. It's still relatively new, devolved government and how they all work with each other. And doing it during COVID was an incredibly new thing. The problem is, again, just structural solutions won't fix it, because what you needed most of all was the politicians putting politics aside and working with each other. And that was what was the sort of, the thing that at times sort of came, or at least they were sort of presenting it. But actually, after a period, it started off the government were going to have all of the first ministers coming along to COBRA meetings, and there was going to be sort of combined decision-making and stuff, and it all just fell by the wayside. And actually, a lot of the time, it's the chief medical officers, and, we have been left with a very good legacy of really good kind of relationships between key parts of the state, but it's that top-level political decision-making. And then just the confusion for the public about which side of the border you're on. Same later when we were looking at the sort of, the different bits, different sort of rules going on in different parts of the country. And I mean, I remember having to recommend to, senior civil servant of has anyone thought of just putting a postcode finder on a government website so that people can find out what lockdown rules exist in their area? 2 weeks later, there was a postcode finder. So I'm
well
taking
done.
that as a win.
Place in
Thank you very
history
much.
secured.
Yeah.
And also, even ministers and the police didn't know the difference between what they'd changed the law to be and what they were advising people to do and what you could fine somebody for.
Yeah.
Well, we had all these examples where the police would only find out about big rule changes by watching that press conference every afternoon.
Yeah,
at 6
having
p.m.
watched Chris Mason Phil for 2 hours on the news beforehand.
Exactly, and then having to put it in place literally 3 hours later. And these could be big rule changes. At one point, they brought in this fine of, I think it was up to £10,000 at one
in
point.
England.
And Priti Patel was giving evidence to the inquiry on this point, and we got pushed and pushed and pushed, and eventually said, no, that was not acceptable. That should never have happened. So there were all these kind of these policies that were brought in at the time, which ended up getting junked very, very quickly.
And Jim, I know there's bereaved families as a group have been at the inquiry and all the hearings. Have we heard from them today? And we heard from other people who were affected? Because, of course, the bereaved families at the inquiry don't represent everyone who had COVID.
No, definitely. I mean, I was listening to some of the comments actually just before I came and spoke to you. And generally, I think they're very supportive of the findings today. They think that there's always a suspicion with these things that you don't get the criticism that you want, I think, from their perspective. And there's lots of, kind of recommendations and comments about structures and that kind of thing. But I think there's a reasonable amount of satisfaction with how far she's gone today.
And Kath, just in terms of immediate political implications, I just wonder if there's going to be increased heat on this guy, Chris Wormold. You've mentioned him already because he was the permanent secretary at the Department of Health during this period, so the most senior civil servant there. Yeah. He's now the most senior civil servant of all because he's the cabinet secretary, and there have already been briefings in the newspapers over the last few months that the current government aren't sure about him in that job.
Yeah, I mean,
this will add to that.
Yeah, it'll definitely add to it, or will give them ammunition if they want it. I mean, his future is going to come down to two things. One is, how does this continue? We're talking here a couple of hours after it came out, but it's does this fade away, tomorrow over the weekend? Are people really exercised about this? And the pressure is on those key figures. And he is obviously one who is still in government. I think there are obviously questions there about his judgment and what he was doing. But ultimately, this is going to come down to, does the current Prime Minister have faith in him? And that's going to be, yes, obviously about this, but it's probably more going to be about how he is performing as Cabinet Secretary. So who knows?
And Jim, where do you think this, I mean, obviously the inquiry goes into the other modules, which are about, as you said, education and vaccines and all sorts of other areas. Where do you think this bit of the inquiry kind of goes now as a story?
Well, each set of recommendations then gets looked at by the current government, and then they have to respond, and then there's some toing and froing between both sides. I think there is some concrete stuff that's come out of... We had the findings from the first module back in, July 2024. And just to give you an example, one of the recommendations was every 3 years, we need to be running these pandemic training exercises. Because one of the problems earlier in the pandemic is you had these big exercises with weird code names and stuff.
Cygnus
and things like that. But the results were never made public. And we only found out afterwards through leaks to the newspapers and stuff after COVID that actually the scorecard on these things was terrible. Like, they tested it, but actually half the stuff wasn't even working. So what she said,
lots of people would have died.
and lots of people would have died. So this time round, one of the recommendations was you run these training exercises every 3 years, but you publicly then have to say these are the results, which allows the press and people like Catherine and people like that to look at it and go like, this is what's going wrong. So we're having one at the moment called Exercise Pegasus, I think. And so we should get the results of that next year. So there is some stuff going on that could generally make a difference.
Yeah, but it does come down to, again, like there are a lot of civil servants who will now be, deeply sort of expert on this stuff, and lots who already who work around civil contingencies or pandemic preparedness or stuff like that. And they will all be involved. And it is really important that they start to work through stuff. But they're still going to be like deep in it. It's whether or not the ministers are actually prepared for, if they end up in this scenario, how are you going to respond to it? How is it going to feel? And do you understand what your role is compared to what the civil service role is? And so I think there's different elements of preparedness that you've got to do that isn't just going to be solved by those kind of exercises. They do slightly different things.
And of course, the next virus will probably be different.
Exactly.
People will react differently because we've all experienced the last one.
Yeah. And I used to see this, used to study intelligence, and, it was always, every time there was an intelligence failure and something bad happened, it would overcorrect by responding to what had happened, not against what would happen, what different thing would happen in the future. So, yeah, you've always got to play through in your mind of like, the next thing is going to be a complete twist on it or be very different.
And just to end where we started with the idea of too little, too late, I sort of struggled to get my head around that for the afternoon, because I thought, well, duh, obvious. That's just a logical conclusion of like, of course, if you acted differently and earlier, there would be a different outcome. And then I thought, well, hang on, maybe it's also a bit unfair, because that's in an idealized world where you can do whatever you want at whatever point you want. But then I got to this sentence from Baroness Hallett that kind of made it click for me. And she said, the COVID-19 lockdowns, and this is in the report, only became inevitable because of the acts and omissions of the 4 governments. So the devolved governments and the UK government. And that just for me changed that the COVID lockdowns weren't because of COVID. They were because politicians didn't take a course of action that meant we didn't have to have the lockdowns. And that is that's a mind shift.
Yeah.
And a lot goes back to planning again. And I totally see your point on that. But if you look at other countries, South Korea, Japan to a certain extent, countries in the Far East, they managed to avoid the strict lockdowns that we did because they had a proper test and trace system, because they had other measures in place. Now, you can argue a lot of that is historical because of earlier outbreaks of other viruses and that kind of thing. But it was definitely possible to do something different. It wasn't inevitable that we had to go down this route.
Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And Kath, thanks to you too.
Thank you.
Now, the UN climate change negotiations, known as COP, are coming to an end in Belém, on the edge of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, where they've been going on for a couple of weeks now. You might not have been aware that they were coming to an end, or even really that they were happening, because they did not get a huge amount of media attention. You can guess why that might be, or theorize why that might be, ranging from changing politics in lots of countries to the US pulling out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which is the basis for a lot of these talks. But we thought we'd dive into them towards the end of the process to find out if the sticking points are the same sticking points that they always have at these climate change conferences. Basically, a division between countries that want to push forward with a transition away from fossil fuels and into green energy, and other countries which are less keen to do that. And then, of course, you've got developing countries that are bearing the brunt of the changes to our climate already. So we caught up with Rachel Kyte, who is the UK's special representative for climate, a sort of diplomatic, political, but independent role from the government. And she spoke to me from the flat that she's rented in Belém. Rachel, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you. So the special representative for climate is a job that was unfilled for a bit in the last government. So maybe people are a bit unfamiliar with what it is now that it's back. Could you just give us the quick kind of pitch for what your job is?
Yeah, it's back with a bit of a difference. So I was appointed by David Lammy and when he was Foreign Secretary, and Ed Miliband as Secretary of State for Net Zero and Energy Security. And the idea was that that we needed to put climate change and nature at the heart of our foreign policy and the way we engage with countries around the world. For me, that's the energy transition, speeding it up in the other parts of the world. That's a lot of trade and investment, as well as technical advice and cooperation.
Okay, well, as COP comes to a close in the next, few days, or actually, you could probably count it in hours now. What
48
brush?
hours.
Yeah, what brush still needs to be cleared?
Well, I think, so it's 10 years since the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was a balance, right? It was a balance of we've got to limit heating to below 2 degrees, later refined to 1.5. That means that we're going to have to transition away from fossil fuels. That was agreed a couple of years ago. That means that we need to invest extensively in getting green electrons flowing through wires so that people can have energy, that energy is clean, that it's reliable, that it's affordable, and then you run your economy off that, which means that you have to have massive electrification. That means you've got to take heavy industry and make it more efficient and cleaner. And you've got to take care of agriculture, and we've got to protect the forests, right? So that's dealing with emissions. And then on the other hand, we wouldn't leave anybody behind, which means that we have to really protect the most vulnerable. We have to provide the finance for that. So it's a balance. And what happens in a negotiation like this is countries who are saying, look, we're not going to you can't prescribe to us how we do this. We'll decide how to do it, but we'll need help. And so that's the fear of oil producers, for example, that we're going to tell them that they can't produce any more oil. It's a transition. People will continue to produce oil. The question is, how do we manage the emissions from that? Who benefits from that? Who doesn't? We need to protect the forests. Well, how to protect the forests? Who's investing in the forest? Big issue. And then the vulnerability. We are falling behind in the provision of finance in all kinds of different ways to protect people. And we're now at a point where science has brought the future forward. We're experiencing a severity of climate impacts now that I think when the Paris Agreement was agreed, we thought wouldn't happen until the 2030s, maybe the early 2040s. So everything has to be on an accelerated pace. And it's how do you accelerate that that's really causing a lot of I think angst here.
You mentioned forests. So one of the centerpieces of this COP is this new forestry fund that Brazil has been pushing, the TFFFF, Tropical Forest Forever Fund. Now, if I understand it correctly, the idea there is that countries and institutions and people with money get together, set up this fund, and then that fund raises money, which is then paid to countries to basically not cut down their forests, to kind of steward their forests for the good of the planet and the climate. Is that how it's meant to work?
Yeah, there's a couple of just tweaks on that description. The fund will be made up of two tranches. In one, the junior tranche, or the more risk-taking tranche, will be funds coming from countries. So far you've got Norway, Germany, Brazil itself, Indonesia, and others. And then there would be a senior tranche, which will be pension funds, insurers as investors, investment banks, and others. So there'll be private money and public money in one fund. That fund invests in the markets. The yield on that investment then flows to tropical forest countries that are committed to managing their forests with integrity, and 20% of the proceeds that flow to these countries will flow directly to indigenous peoples and local communities. That's the theory. It's self-sustaining, and it's an investment. It's not a handout.
And the UK helped to come up with this idea, but the Prime Minister's decided not to invest in it with money.
Yeah, it's we've been involved for over 2 years working on the technical aspects of this, and then for the last 9 months or more in the sort of structuring of the fund and helping the World Bank and Brazil work together to build the back office for that. And we've been doing investor conversations in the City of London to judge interest and also talk through with them what they would need to see the fund be in order for them to invest. And then the timing's bad, right? The budget is just coming up after COP, and so it's a not now, not a no never.
Okay, so we're not ruling out ponying up some money at some point. It's just not going to be in the very near future.
Yeah, so it's not during this COP, and it won't be till after the budget, but we're looking at the best ways to do it. Different countries are investing in that junior tranche in different ways, and we're all still in conversation with each other. And the Brazilians are still, holding out hope that we will invest, and we're having a good look at it, but we can't do anything before the budget.
And has the UK's climate leadership, as it's known in diplomatic circles, taken a bit of a knock because of that?
Yeah, I think this is the centerpiece of something that's quite extraordinary, and I think that's actually where our leadership's still in place, which is that for more than 20 odd years, right? Well, more than 20 years, we've been at the forefront of thinking about forests. So not just the Amazon, but the Congo Basin, Indonesia. And one of the big evolutions that's evident at this COP is that there's so much innovation around how to finance nature. So how to invest in nature so it can protect us and fulfill its function as a sort of carbon sink, but also provide us with the resilience and the water tables and the support to agriculture that we need. This isn't a nice to have, it's a need to have for the global economy. And we've been at the City of London and the British academic institutions and everybody else has been very much in the forefront of how do we finance nature rather than just expecting aid to flow. And so the TFF is in the middle of it, but there are so many other things already going around, and we're right in the middle of all of that. And so I think that the big challenge for the UK is over the next period is how to really fulfill the government's intent, which is that we sort of move into a world where we will need overseas development assistance, we will need aid, but a lot of that aid will have to leverage large amounts of private finance. And this is something that the government's working on, and we're seeing it in other areas, but we're going to have to double down on that in the area of nature.
I think I heard your doorbell ringing. Has someone come to visit you for some intense climate negotiations?
No, so I'm actually, we're all, the whole British delegation is staying in Airbnbs.
Right.
And I think today is the day my Airbnb gets cleaned.
I hope you've got it booked till the end of the weekend, because these negotiations always overrun, or is there someone's going to turn up and get one in? Well,
the funny story is that they do normally overrun, but the Brazilians are really in a sort of hell for leather sort of race here, because a lot of delegates are staying on 2 Italian cruise ships that were docked on the river, and those cruise ships have to go back to work on Saturday.
Right.
So if we go too late, we're going to have a bunch of homeless negotiators.
Yeah, you might be sharing your Airbnb with some small island state. So the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, the UK was part of a group of 80 countries earlier this week that pitched a sort of roadmap for doing that. What was the purpose of doing that as a diplomatic manoeuvre, and is it being listened to by the many other countries that aren't in the 80?
Yeah, so the purpose of that was twofold. First, when you listen for Guyana, Suriname and Namibia, who've just recently discovered extraordinary reserves of gas and oil, for example, how do they transition away? Can they exploit any of that? How can they exploit it? How do we capture the emissions from that? Who benefits, etc.? That's different from, say, a landlocked, least developed country in Africa that has no exploitable resources, but needs an extraordinary amount of investment in order that the gap in energy access, so they're still living with 70% of the population with no energy, how do we get the investment flowing into their green energy, which is different from the UK, different from Russia, so these transitions countries need a lot of help, but they also need to know, well, is there a way to do it, or am I doing it wrong? Am I thinking about this in the wrong way? So what we felt together with 80 countries, it's a global North, global South coalition, is that actually we need to put some sort of guardrails and some support around helping countries move more quickly. We can't just sort of stand there and say, thou must have a transition. How do we help them?
So help us out here, Rachel. When we get to a final text that's agreed on Friday or Saturday or Sunday, because these things tend to drag on, what words should we look out for in there that will show the UK has managed to push this in the right direction?
Yeah, there'll be language around this not being imposed. I mean, ideally, this would be something that everybody would include in their NDC, their plans, which they have to file with the with the UN, and ideally there would be some reference to this coming back and sort of being assessed or analysed, or at least some sense of where are we on this transitioning away? I mean, do we know where we are? So these are things to look for. You know, is it linked back to the process? Is it actually in there at all? And then how strong is the language around it? But you know, we're part of the 82 or whatever number it is at this moment. But we're there with small island states. We're there with African oil producers. We're there with you know, obviously the consuming countries of the EU. You know, it's a very, very broad coalition. It's not, you know, this is not an east-west or north-south coalition.
And last question, Rachel. I mean, this is a really big one, but I'll be intrigued to see how you think about this. That putting all the pieces together, you've got quite a few political parties in the UK saying, actually, we need to slow down on all of this. It was too ambitious and it comes at too much of a cost to ordinary consumers in the form of their electricity bills. Then you've got big influential thinkers like Bill Gates saying, actually, humanity's going to be fine. Maybe we need to prioritize people's well-being rather than a dash for renewable energy and mitigating our carbon emissions. And then you get people like Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet, who owns Google, talking to the BBC this week saying, well, actually, we do need a lot of electricity very quickly. And he didn't quite say this, but he sort of suggested we should be a little bit more relaxed about the forms that electricity takes. In other words, maybe fossil fuels for a bit longer might be better for the economy and for technology and for business. How do you sum up what direction we're going in now? Because it does feel like there's a bit of a vibe shift.
Yeah, so it's a great question. The three examples are great ones. So just let me just unpick it a little bit. So,
oh no, you could write 10 books on this, I realise.
Yeah, no. So the push. So as I travel around the world, what countries want is they want clean energy, because there are all kinds of benefits from clean energy beyond just clean energy, and that is now for most countries the cheapest source of supply. But they're going to have smart grids that can carry renewables, and they need to change the regulations and the way that the system works, etc. But that's the direction of travel. People know that we are peaking in coal. We've peaked in coal. We're peaking in oil. You know that nobody's really changing the destination, which is that we would be at net zero in the second half of this century. The question is how we get there. And Google, of course, is buying up nuclear power capacity around the world. And countries want fast energy, so they want clean energy and fast energy. Fast energy because they don't want to miss out on the AI revolution, and everybody wants a data center. And so if you can provide, you know, cheap and affordable and reliable power, then that's what they want. Now, for some of those countries, do they have to extend the life of their coal plants a little bit while they're building up all of this green power? Yes. And so I think the destination hasn't changed. The pace of reaching it is in discussion in many countries. To Bill Gates, and my former colleague Christiana Figueres made this point, you know, go tell the people of Jamaica that it's better to just invest in health provision when a storm that has never been seen before in the Caribbean, which was in large part made so severe by the warmth of the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic. Go tell them that we should just invest in communicable diseases and infectious diseases and not in trying to prevent these kinds of storms from becoming worse and worse. It's going to cost Jamaica more than $10 billion. It's more than 30% of their economy. And it isn't just the costs that we can measure, it's the traumatization of villages that will never be able to be built back again, landslides that have taken entire landscapes away. You know, you can't do just one thing and the other. We've got to fast track mitigation of emissions, and we've got to fast track support to people living under climate crisis. So I think what's at stake here is not the point on the horizon to which we're all headed. There's no disagreement with that, not with China, not with India, not with Saudi Arabia, not with anybody. The United States is leaving, fine, it may come back again. The question, and I think it's why it's so intense, is because these are the difficult economic decisions you make about how fast you go down that track. But we're going in that direction. And the sooner that people can feel in their wallets and in their lives that this renewable energy, which is driving the economy, is good for them in the short term as well as in the long term, the better. And so in the UK, that's a question of, where do we put the green levies? Do we put them on the electricity bill, the gas bill, the general taxation? How much more international investment can we pull into the green energy march? And since the government came in, we've seen, large amounts of investment coming into carbon capture, storage and use, into more renewables, into the manufacturing of the component parts for renewables. And that's, 400,000 jobs, I think, estimated at the last time I looked. So the problem is it isn't necessarily felt. But when you go on the doorstep, what do people want? They want an affordable electricity bill, quite right. And if we can get the regulation on that right, then they'll see that, all the renewable energy we've got, it isn't the renewable energy that makes the electricity bill high. It's the way that we've put taxation around it.
Okay.
Secondly, they want clean air, clean water, flood defences and protection from extreme heat. All of those things we can only do if we continue to mitigate carbon emissions, if we continue to bring them down.
And do you think the big green rabbit Rachel Reeves is going to pull out of her hat next week is taking the costs of the energy transition off individual energy bills and putting it on general taxation? In other words, people who pay more taxes will pay more for the transformation of our energy system rather than people on lower incomes having to sort of pay the same on their bills.
Yeah, the general theory of this is that you should help people on low income to be able to transition so that they can keep their homes warm and lower their bills and be safe in their homes, and that you should put the balance of this in a way that doesn't penalise energy or households. But I have to say, my crib off the answer to that question is that I've been here in negotiations night and day for the last week, and I can't keep up with all of the drip, drip, drip of what is and isn't happening. So I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. But we can come back to you for a reaction when we all know. And
Absolutely.
Rachel, it's been great to speak to you. Lots to think about. And I mean this in all respect. I can sort of tell you've been working very, very hard for the last 2 weeks. There's a slight tiredness there, which is testament to how hard you've been working.
Yeah, there's people working harder than me, but but I think that, look, there's 194 countries still in. One that left or is leaving. But there's, no matter how hard these negotiations are, 194 countries are still trying to do this, and that's what we need, because this is a sort of crisis that affects all of us in different ways, and we can't do this on our own.
Well, Rachel, thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.